To this day, I cannot understand how I could have so disregarded the political and social events in the beginning of 1968 for what they were. I had my first sweet child of 3 months, and I was on maternity leave, enchanted with my new role as a mother. It was on May 1st, International Workers' Day, as I remember. I realized that something truly revolutionary was happening. There was a change which, as major changes usually come about, crept on the dove's feet, as my favorite philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche has written. It could not escape my attention that in only a few months the nation, which had previously been angry, indifferent, grumpy and skeptical, suddenly began rejoicing in the streets. This time, people joined the May 1st procession, which previously had been mandatory, of their own free will, and they smiled up to the major dignitaries on the podium on Wenceslas Square. People held hands, encouraging them and paying their respects by giving a thumbs up. Signed Alexander Dubcek was the first secretary of the Central Committee of the ruling Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, and we had a new president, General Ludvík Svoboda. Novotný, the previous president, had to resign. Censorship was spontaneously fading away, and people were assembling together as they pleased. On the editorial board of Mladý svět, Young World, where I had returned to work as a journalist and editor, there reigned a festive and excited atmosphere. I was sent immediately to one district town to write about the local process of renewal. I went to meetings organized by students where we spoke with both higher and lower Communist Party functionaries. They were friendly and joyful. They were friendly and joyful, even to the point of talking behind the backs of those who were not present and making silly jokes. When someone would ask about something definite from the past, they spoke of mistakes that had been made, and how they were now going to set everything right. They revealed in their newfound popularity. Now that for the first time in their lives someone was taking them seriously, and they promised that from now on everything would be different. Comrades, there will be plenty of meat, the first secretary and president of Czechoslovakia, Novotný, had proclaimed several years ago from the tribunal, and there was. In the spring of 1968, we were promised democracy, a well-functioning economy, justice and correction of wrongdoing, rehabilitation and freedom. I didn't even mind that these promises were being made by the very same communists who had introduced socialism to us and had constructed it. Now they wish to reform their work by giving it a human face. But I remember the violence of the past, like the brutal collectivization, the expropriation of farms and land. A farmer whom we used to visit on each summer holiday shot our beloved watchdog because, as he told us with tears in his eyes, there was nothing to watch over anymore. On a neighboring farm, a farmer was labeled a kulak and jailed on the suspicion that he was said to have a transmitter in the attic with which he sent messages to the enemies of socialism, to the imperialists. His daughters were my friends, and they said that it must have been cooing doves who were nesting under the roof. My grandmother was evicted from her flat in the Prague Old Town. The flat was then occupied by a communist dignitary from Moravia. My best school chum's father was jailed and hanged during the Slansky trials. The Stalin-inspired Chow trials of 1952. I knew that we lived behind barbed wire, and that those who tried to escape to the west would be shot by border guards. I actually saw the barbed wire for the first time in 1965, when they began to allow us to visit the West. We exchanged our Czech crowns for $10 only per person. They would not allow us to take more than that. And they sent us on our way with remarks such as this: go and beg something from the German and or American imperialists. Let them take care of you. In 1965, I immediately went to a work camp in Turkey. Together with American Quakers, we built a laundry facility in the middle of a high plain. I preferred not to go to Western Europe, since there I would be a beggar. In the camp, we worked for our food, and I did not have to explain to anyone that I was not an indoctrinated communist idiot. As a volunteer, I went to Japan on a recultivation project, and then I worked in a kibbutz in Israel.
In the 1950s, the communists had unleashed real terror. People disappeared without a trace. Innocent people were sentenced, even tortured, until they would finally confess to all the charges of which they were accused. The innocent were sentenced to death in show trials that targeted traitors and revisionists. In the 1950s, communists spread terror and fear, which was transmitted to my generation, even though we were unable to make decisions about anything. In their minds, people returned to the time of the Nazi protectorate. The fears and anxieties of our parents penetrated our minds so that we were unable to rid our minds of those thoughts. In the 1960s, by way of contrast, were the times of our youth. Repression eased. A new generation, my own generation, was forming in opposition to all the regulations, threats, harassment, and persecutions. We were not like the communist youth, Marxists and communists who denounced their schoolmates who held opinions which differed from their own. At the end of the 1950s, social structures revived, and social life was reborn and began to exist on its own. Society had to transform itself from the grassroots up and to wait for suitable moments to act. People began to gather together on cultural platforms, and they exerted political pressure on behalf of what real life required. The official culture was of no interest to them. Eventually, they began to explore their own possibilities as much as they were able. They established their own publishing houses for banned authors. They read forbidden authors. They sought out forbidden thoughts in the banned book sections of their libraries. They smuggled manuscripts abroad. The process of freeing oneself started in small theaters. From the theater stage, people heard what they were unable to say in public. In the semi-darkness of the theater, they reacted spontaneously. It was no longer ideological theater, a theater that was moralizing and which showed hot, timely topics. At this time, Václav Havel began writing absurd dramas, and the Czech New Wave appeared in film. Political prisoners who had been sentenced in the 1950s were released. Books which could not be published 10 years earlier now appeared in print, and every Thursday morning we joined the queues in front of the bookshops. Václav Havel was not only a successful playwright in Na Zabradlí theater, but he was also on the editorial board of Tvář, a monthly magazine of Writers' Union. This magazine bravely fought for its existence with the Central Committee of the Czechoslovak Communist Party and with all who were in power. A new generation was being formed, all the polemics and disputes, and they embraced the political engagement. In the Writers' Union, communist writers criticized the system, and thus a process of reform began. This introduced a time of resolutions and abdications. Critical writers were readmitted to the communist parties, even those who had been executed in the 1950s. At the party's Central Committee meeting, a new government was named, consisting of only reform communists.
I was young and critical. I became a reporter, eventually winning the most popular reporter award in Mladý Svět magazine. At this time, in the spring of 1968, I also began publishing in the weekly Literární listy. This journal was published by the Writers' Union and was even more critical than Mladý Svět. My articles were called A-Socialism, and I reported on the hard and illegal work of women in heavy industry and on night shifts. I wrote about homes for retired people with titles like What a Good Living We Shall Have. Tak se budeme mít. Journalists were constantly discovering new topics, dismantling old secrets, and one scandal followed another. Newspapers attracted new readership, and people eagerly watched television and listened to the radio more than ever before.
Freedom of the press came about spontaneously, but it was only legalized by the National Assembly in June. The press, radio, and television criticized societal illusions. People learned about the show trials, executions, and activities of the secret police, and about the benefits which communist functionaries received. The new program of the Communist Party was published. The general public was pleased, and there were no calls for revenge or retaliation. Ardent supporters of socialism, those party members who enjoyed a good living, began to rebel against these new orders. Economists were promising people that they would administer the state better, and that they promised trade unions and workers' councils that would involve workers more in their work, and that they would be rewarded for it. They wished to remove authoritarian leadership and replace it with economic models concerned with profits, prices, taxes, and competition. They wished to replace the bureaucratic machinery. Those enterprises which produced at a loss were to be either closed down or modernized. Small private enterprises would again be allowed to exist. Another reform idea that was introduced in the party program was cooperation with foreign capitalist companies in order to reinforce competition. They proposed a free and convertible currency. People believed in this new government plan. A public collection, the Fund for the Republic, or Fond Republiky, was started, to which people donated money, gold, and jewelry. In 2 weeks' time, the fund had collected 159 million crowns and 40 kilograms of gold. The party, which had never doubted its leading role, was now part of a greater reform movement. As totalitarian power retreats from its monopoly of power, it begins to crumble like a brick wall when a single brick is pulled out. The reform program, designed by reformers, only reacted to shifts in public opinion. Reconfirmation of the party's new leading role persuaded no one. Only the rhetoric was softer. The old communists, however, grew fearful, especially as journalists pointed to deep economic and social problems, and as they wrote about the crimes of communism. New groups and associations were formed, and society became more open and democratic. Party leaders reacted to the radicalization by speeding up the reform process and supporting and defending those who spoke about counter-revolution. Our politicians were pretending to be saviors of the nation, but even though they had the confidence of the people, they lied to them instead. They told us, "We are with you, so you should be with us," their deceitful slogan. At the very same time, these party leaders were speaking with Soviet leaders, and they knew the Soviet intentions well, to save socialism in our land at any cost. Alexander Dubcek and the other leaders were unable to rid themselves of their illusions about the nature of the Soviet socialism. In June 1968, socialist bloats armies conducted their military maneuvers in our land. Conservative communists who had lost their leading position complained to Moscow. The press in the Warsaw Pact countries wrote openly of counter-revolution in Czechoslovakia. People were fearful, but they still had confidence in the country's leadership. At the last meeting on the Slovakian and Ukrainian border, the Soviet delegation claimed that in the Second World War they had lost 20 million lives defending Czechoslovakia, and they were not about to give it up to NATO or Czechoslovakian right-wingers. At the beginning of August, Dubček had held talks in Bratislava and declared that there was no reason for fear or loss of sovereignty, but he kept quiet about a second agreement, which spoke of the united duty of all socialist countries to defend socialism in each individual countries. Reform communists were fearful of losing popularity, which they considered a healing balm for their party and ideological wounds from the past. To show Soviet socialism without its ideological illusions would be seen as sacrilege. They needed to rehabilitate themselves, which is why they needed to rehabilitate socialism. And to this end, they sacrificed the last shreds of their country's independence. Party leaders were still resolving the party's relationship to its doctrines, practices, and ideals, but they were not really interested in how the party related to society. They wanted to continue to rule, but didn't know what to do. Military resistance would be too risky. Party leaders could argue that the army was ready to fight, but those who were willing to fight, even at the cost of their lives, were ordered not to fight by these same party leaders. From a historical perspective, defeat was considered to be less harmful than capitulating without putting up a fight. Once again, the lack of responsibility and small-mindedness of Czechoslovakian politicians was apparent to all. Being dedicated subjects to our traditional choice, wrote Petr Pirart in his book Osmaštěstí. Sorry.
68. and the name is Petr Pirart.
I quote again from this well-known Czech political scientist: "The choice of primitive demagoguery in the threatening situation rather than the range of defensive options is a stereotype of Czech politics." On August 21st, the Warsaw Pact, an army of 5 countries, invaded Czechoslovakia. The Communist Party leaders were taken to Moscow. In Moscow, all except František Kriegel signed their names to the disgraceful protocol that justified this invasion. During the 6 days before their political leaders returned from Moscow, Czechs and Slovaks were without leadership. People undertook smart and witty measures of resistance. Non-politicians were even more courageous than politicians. Politicians underestimated crafty Czech hands and brains. We may question whether an isolated attempt to democratize a political system, either gradually or in a radical way, would actually have succeeded. In the spring of 1968, changes were announced, but there were no political power to put them into practice. I think we should have expressed our determination to use all means to defend ourselves, since the geographical location of our country was to our advantage. Possibly, we could have defended ourselves, even if it had not come to open conflict. After all, Romania and Yugoslavia had not allowed the armies of their allies to enter their lands. Tiny Vietnam had fought bravely against the United States for several years. Perhaps the reform communists would have capitulated anyway, since they were unsure of how to deal with this burst of freedom. And what would have happened if there had been no military invasion? Supplies were exhausted. The economy was almost bankrupt. A sad and barely qualified leadership existed, inasmuch as each boss was a communist first of all, with skills and abilities of only secondary importance. The gray economy flourished. Consumers could obtain everything that was not available in the stores on the black market. People were stealing from and cheating a state which they did not consider to be their own. Enormous technological and building projects with no useful purpose were constructed. Socialism revealed itself to be a luxury which we could no longer afford. Why are Czech politicians so small-minded and cowardly? Why do they give up so easily? Historically, they were always submissive to foreign powers, Austria, Germany, Russia, and most recently China. They were always seeking a powerful protector who, in 1938, betrayed them in the Munich Agreement. I think that this probably contributed to the fact that many Czech and Slovak peoples voted for the communists after the Second World War in 1947. Even today, we do not believe that our state really belongs to us as a community for which we bear responsibility, and we lack the ability to find allies and to show solidarity. An unfriendly and hostile relationship to our state may possibly be the key to all of our current political shortcomings. We Czechs have always functioned better in some kind of community, yet we always behave like difficult children. We were naughty in Vienna under Austria, and now we are naughty in Brussels under the European Union. Czechs and Slovaks have always had many bad experiences with Germans. Perhaps we also resisted the thought of being attacked by our best friend, the Soviet Union. The reformed communists had no intention of comparing communism with Nazism. But how could it be that they did not understand how the Soviets had formed the Soviet Union by force? How in the early 1940s the Soviet Union had invaded Baltic countries? How they now use the very same method in the invasion of our country in 1968. The Soviet Union had always found a fifth column in a country which called for help. The Warsaw Pact was invited by the conservative wing of the Communist Party to stop the reforms by invading my country.
Here I would like to pause and mention that 20 years later I saw the so-called letter of invitation. It was brought to the Prague castle and placed in the hands of Václav Havel by a clerk with a soft, unhealthy face, a clerk who was wearing a badly fitting and crumpled suit. The letter of invitation was typed on yellow socialist paper, complete with typing errors. I stared at it, and then I realized that this lousy piece of paper had destroyed 20 years of my life. And not only my own, but that of entire generation. I was also there when Dubcek met with Václav Havel in 1989 during the Velvet Revolution. I must say that Dubcek disappointed me, for during those years, when he was removed from political life, he had no change at all. He remained ever the weak apparatchik, devoted to the Soviet Union and the reformed communists who desired power. To this day, I can't understand how I could have been so reckless as to accept an invitation to join a delegation to Israel in July 1968. I left that summer for Israel with a group of young journalists, aspiring writers, and students activists. We wanted to prod the encourage of our government to renew diplomatic relations with Israel, relationship that had been disrupted during the Six-Day War a year before. Because our government, together with the Soviet Union, took the side of the Arabs. We were to work in a kibbutz and learn about communism in practice. To tell the truth, I didn't like it at all, since I'm allergic to ideologies, although I understood that in Israel one could not live without it. I didn't like living in a collective since I was too individualistic. Back in Prague, I had left my sweet baby in the care of my husband, who was still a student. On August 21st, at 10 a.m. near Nazareth, We learned from our Russian guide that our country was being invaded by the Warsaw Pact armies. We skipped Nazareth and went straight to Jerusalem. There we walked down the Via Dolorosa, and I was hitting my head against the Wailing Wall. It was as though Czechoslovakia had ceased to exist. Since the invaders had disrupted air travel and every other contact was impossible, since phone lines had also been disconnected. We spent all night at the Reuters news agency and waited for any news on the telex. We learned of horrible events, such as that the old town square was occupied by tanks and that Soviet cannons were aimed at the Prague castle. They were ready to shoot it to pieces if the Czechoslovaks did not sign their ultimatum. Soon we were sought out by journalists. I was attractive for them, since I was the mother of a small child and I also knew English reasonably well. I began my struggle through the media as I spoke against the invasion for television. We took up a public collection for the good of the cause. A few of us even decided to form guerrilla unit, and we even went to see Moshe Dayan to ask him for guns. We really wished to fight the Soviet Union. In departing for Israel, I had caused pain to myself in two ways. First, my little child was stayed behind in a country that was now ceased to exist. Second, I had to accept the capitulation of my country in faraway Israel, which had won its war in defense of its country 1 year earlier. Run, Jews who had survived the Holocaust were calling out to me, for they saw the invasion as a bad omen for the future. They offered to let us stay in Israel and study Hebrew. They offered us financial help as well. We were surrounded by loving care. They told me that I would be taken to a Siberian gulag as soon as I crossed the border, and that I would be accused of Zionism and would be viewed as having been infected with a hostile ideology. They offered us warm clothing. I decided that I had to at least return to the proximity of my country, somewhere where I could find out what was happening. I flew to Rome, and there was no news there since the borders were closed and the telephone and mail were not functioning. I moved to Vienna, and there, after standing in a line for 3 hours, I was finally able to call home. My omnipotent father ordered me to return immediately. Excuse me. Ran away. An old Jewish lady with whom I stayed in Vienna told me in Vienna. There were thousands of Czechs walking around with pale faces and glistening eyes. I found a bus with Czech license plates by the St. Stephen's Cathedral, and I took one of the seats which had been left empty after those who had chosen to run away and had left the bus. When I reached my home street in Prague early in the morning, I was stopped by Soviet soldiers. They wanted to see my passport, and they said, "Z kurorta priechala děvočka." a young girl returning from her vacations. They had parked their tanks behind them, and on the slope opposite our house were machine gun posts.
The Czechoslovakian government had begun making compromises too soon, which were accepted by citizens who believed that the foreign armies would soon leave. In September, new laws concerning censorship and the abolition of freedom of assembly were approved. The media explained the presence of the army as a necessity in order to secure the safety of all socialist countries from West German revolutionist powers. Eventually, what our comrades had signed in Moscow became public knowledge. At this point, the paths of the people and the party leaders definitively diverged. Magazines and newspapers which defended the pre-August lines ceased publication. Conservatives started their own media, a spontaneous fund for the Republic with 273 million crowns and 80 kilos of gold was absorbed by the state treasury. For a few hours, Dubcek was trying to satisfy the requirements of Moscow and, simultaneously, the complaints of citizens. The Communist Party leadership was explaining that peace could only be preserved if citizens would only be quiet and not take to the streets. They explained that strikes and any other kinds of protests would ruin all reform efforts. On January 16, 1969, a student of history, Jan Palach, burned himself to death in protest against government policy. Students embarked upon a sit-down strike and police dispersed the street demonstrations. The greatest wave of immigration in the 20th century removed thousands of talented and educated citizens. An exemplary totalitarian leader, Dr. Gustav Husak, appeared to take power in his own hands to promote normalization, the process by which the Communist Party's power would be reinstated. He became the first secretary of the Central Committee of Czechoslovak Communist Party, then the president as well. The greatest opponents of the reform movement were rewarded with high government positions. Purges took place. Citizens had to sign that they were in agreement with the occupation or else they would be fired. The first political show trials began.
Allow me to return to my own story now. I wrote an article for Listy magazine about Jan Zajíc, a second student who on February 25, 1969 had burned himself to death on the day of commemoration for the communist coup d'etat of 1945. Jan Palach, the first student, received a state funeral, but Jan Zajíc was buried quietly in a local cemetery in the place where he was born. Vítkov by Opava in northern Moravia. Listy, the magazine where I worked as a reporter, ceased publication shortly thereafter, and I was branded as the most counter-revolutionary magazine, Listy was branded as the most counter-revolutionary magazine in the country. The names of all Listy reporters, the editors were listed, and those whose names were on the list were not allowed to publish, including mine. The promoters of normalization sealed the borders. Unlike in the 50s, this violence was more civilized. People lost their professional positions and had to work as manual laborers instead, but they were not condemned to death. Officially, the regime promised a peaceful life and peace in change for work. No one notified me of any publications ban, so I had to learn about it later from my own experience. Again, I have never understood how people could give in so easily. How could they allow themselves to be normalized, to admit that was once white was now the color black and vice versa? What was normal? People were afraid of each other. The state police were triumphant. But I must admit that I was in despair. My husband was studying at the film college, and I promised him I would provide a livelihood for our own family. There was an old house in our village where a mental hospital had been installed in a former monastery. It contained about 600 incurable patients. It was an institution for chronic patients who were either schizophrenic or bipolar. I visited with the chief physician and offered to come in as volunteer and help out the nurses. The chief physician welcomed his assistants. 2 nurses were in charge of about 70 patients, and they could barely manage the dress and feed them. My task was to converse with the patients. Only much later did I understand that I was afraid of going mad myself, and therefore I went straight to a mental institution. As I spent more time with the patients, I realized that the situation was not so bad in comparison with their situation. Paradoxically, I felt freer behind the bars of the institution than outside. It seemed to me that life was more normal inside than outside under the normalization regime. In the hospital, patients could say whatever they pleased because they had already been declared insane. To write articles and reports to hide away in a desk drawer and wait for better times to publish them made no sense. And so I began writing short stories about people who had spent 30 or 40 years inside a mental institution and who therefore had never experienced real socialism in the outside world. Most of them were old and they had not been treated with modern psychopharmaceutical drugs. Hence they retained vivid associations. For me, it was like raw material for me, it was raw material for surrealistic poetry. As a journalist, I was used to working with facts, but these souls inspired me in an ability to tell stories. They took me into their world of madness, which appeared more normal than the world outside the bars of the institution. They helped me, in fact, much more than I was able to help them. The beginning of the 1970s was the hardest time of my life so far. Many friends had lost their professional jobs because they refused to sign statements admitting that they agreed with the invasion and with the fact that those armies had invaded in order to liberate us from counter-revolution. Spines were cracking and bending, people were hanging their heads like dogs, and they didn't want to look into the eyes of other people. We were fearful of one another, and the old fear from the days of the Nazi protectorate in the 50s sprang to life again. Some people even crossed the street to the other side to avoid somebody, to avoid meeting with Václav Havel or Ludvík Vaculík. The regime didn't use violence as it had in the 50s. It was not so cruel and not so nervous about those who were labeled enemies of socialism or hooligans for handing out leaflets to encourage people not to vote, since only one party was on the ballot. Opponents of the regime were labeled as Trotskyites, or even were sentenced just for singing band songs in a pub. Later, I was able to obtain a position at the university archive with some help. I was organizing old magazines and papers, but I could have had a much worse job. I also had to classify letters from political informers from the 50s. The most primitive that I had ever seen, letters from housekeepers and street informers, full of hatred, revenge, and spiteful dirt about others. In one word, ghastly. It was dark everywhere, and it seemed that it would be like that forever. Back then, we knew that future generation would pay for the actions of their parents and grandparents during the communist era. Society was overcome by fear, and petitions and protests hopelessly disappeared down the storm drains of history. Inasmuch as the Husak regime carried out normalization in a ghastly intelligent manner. No problem ever saw the light of day, trials were held in secret, and all information was kept hidden away.
In 1975, Václav Havel wrote an open letter addressed to Dr. Gustav Husak. Havel's friends considered this a kamikaze suicidal mission. The brilliant essayist Havel described the current situation in precisely the right terms, and we were all relieved, even though we feared that he would be jailed immediately. Havel, perhaps because he himself was afraid of what would happen to him, first analyzed fear as a systemic tool for carrying out existential pressure exercised by the state police. Fear was something that not a single citizen could escape. Amid deep economic and moral crises, the system extended power to people without morals, to opportunists who opened themselves to any humiliation and who were prepared even to sacrifice their own family members in order to please those in power. In such a system, people become disinterested, unconcerned, and detached. And that was the main goal of state policy. They performed political rituals in order to secure peace and enough time to eliminate chronic shortages of goods. But peace and order came at a deadly cost for society. Culture was castrated and made banal, just right for simple, shallow people. According to Havel, somewhere at the base of power is the principle of death. He pushed the limits of what could be tolerated, and the authorities did not put him in jail immediately. He and Ludwig Vaculik always stood on the edge, and with their every action they tried to enlarge a space for life for all who were labeled as shaken by philosopher Jan Potočka. Many people delegated their responsibility to Václav Havel, and he relieved them from pricks of conscience. The letter circulated in duplicate form, and people came to understand how the individual things that worried them were all interconnected. They realized the complexity of the demonic master plan of normalization.
I had 2 small children. During the day I worked at the archives, and at night I kept on writing to keep myself from going crazy. I tried to submit my manuscript to publishers. At first they spoke me and accepted the manuscript. But when I called them again, they refused even to speak with me, as though they could catch some terrible disease from me over the phone. Some publishers wrote to me that the book was too existential, too naturalistic, and that did not fit with their publishing plans, etc. I tried it with 2 books, and always it was the same response. When I had 3 manuscripts in my desk drawer, Ludwig Vaculik came to see me and offered to publish them in Padlock Press, Edice Petlice, an underground press which he had founded. The books emerged as carbon copy editions, always in 12 copies. Back then I met with a typist, Zdena Ertutová Filipsová, who copied and gave life to about 150 titles, some of which were copied more than once. She typed on a back console typewriter and her fingernails bled. I began publishing in underground publishing houses. Václav Havel ran Expedition Press, Edice Expedice, which published foreign authors in translation, also essays. And his stories. He took personal responsibility and signed the copies himself. Vladimír Pistorius started the Kramerius Press, Krameriova Expedice, and published beautiful books which included illustrations by forbidden authors. As soon as my books appeared in these underground publishing houses, I became an enemy of the socialist state, and I had crossed the limits of illegality. I was called in for interrogation. At first, they asked me to sign an agreement to collaborate. They informed me that I was young and that it would be a shame for me not to cooperate. If I would repent and admit that I had been misled by bad friends, and if I signed that I would be allowed to publish officially again. When I refused to sign, they threatened me. Little by little, they introduced me to their sheet metal hell, with all its bars, padlocks, bolts, and toll bars. I was also reminded that my husband and our children would suffer for my sake on account of my guilty and imprudent behavior. During that time, it helped me a lot. I was practicing yoga, since the breathing and mental exercises helped me to overcome my fears. The interrogators were used to dealing with fear, but when there was no fear, it only made them nervous.
The Plastic People of the Universe was a young band that played rock and roll music. Communist officials were outraged by their music and by the fact that the musicians had long hair and used vulgar language. They took away their artistic license to perform in Prague and later elsewhere in the country. The Plastic People performed in the countryside at various weddings and baptismal ceremonies, and young people kept coming to their concerts from great distances. The police kept guard at railway stations and bus stops, where they rounded up young people and loaded them onto police trucks. Several times they invaded the concerts and beat up the audience. The communist regime was in conflict with young people and refused to allow them to live as they wished and needed to live. In its arrogance, the party assumed the right to decide what people should like. They arrested 19 musicians and their fans, then initiated criminal charges against them. There was a trial in which the human desire for freedom was sentenced, and the musicians were found guilty of playing music which they liked. The audience who gathered in the courtroom formed the first organized protest. There were reform communists, non-party members, young and old alike, all with a shared understanding. Other disputes, differences of opinions, and age gaps no longer mattered. There were Marxists, Trotskyites, intellectuals, workers, and Christians, all of them united and pulling together in a single direction. The trial brought together dissident groups and laid the foundation for Charter 77. In the text of Charter 77 was written by a team, the leading voices of which were Jan Patočka and Václav Havel. Charter 77 addressed the Czechoslovakian government. The signatories asked the government to comply with the Helsinki Protocol, which it had signed, and to respect human rights. The authors and couriers were arrested and interrogated, but their friends managed in the end to get 242 signatures by the 5th of January 1977. The communist government and its representative ministry, the Home Office, began to wage war against these 242 signatories, as if they were conspiring to bring down the regime. The communist government represented socialism, and anyone who opposed them should be persecuted and punished. The government picked up the signatories at home and at work and brought them in for interrogation. They shouted at them, threatened them, and caused them to lose their jobs. They took away their passports, their driver's license, telephones, and even their hunting and fishing licenses. The spokesmen for Charter 77 were interrogated every day for many hours. The media campaign against them was truly dreadful. Back in the 1950s, it would have meant death. When Hovel was jailed, the other two spokesmen worked even harder. Intimidation only had the opposite effect. Indeed, it was said that what had been concealed and forbidden for years was liberating. The communists quickly organized a counteraction. In the National Theater, the sanctuary of Czech culture, they had the cultural elite sign a so-called anti-charter in which artists expressed their disagreement and condemned Charter 77.
I participated in the funeral of the first spoken of Charter 77, my beloved professor of philosophy Jan Patočka, who was killed by the secret police in the course of lengthy interrogation. During the funeral, helicopters circled above the cemetery, and behind the cemetery were motorcycle races. Secret policemen were silently sitting on the gravestones and filming us. Then and there, I promised myself not to have anything to do with such a regime. Since I was unemployed at that time, I was in no danger of losing my job. I soon made friends with writers, artists, historians, philosophers, and other intellectuals who had been part of the dissident movement. I began attending so-called quarterly meetings organized by Ludvík Vaculík. 4 times a year we would meet for a weekend at some secret location in Bohemia, Moravia, or Slovakia. Each month we published a magazine entitled Obsah, Content, a literary review. Each member of our junta, as Vaculík nicknamed the founding members, had to submit an essay, a short story, or a poem, typed in 14 copies, later in 28 copies. That condition made it difficult for me. Often I would finish my story on page 6, since I didn't wish to retype it again. Carbon copies were crumpled, or else I put them into the typewriter with the wrong side up, and therefore the text was copied on the back of the typed page. Despite that, I always fulfilled my promise, and I was no longer fearful that I would lose my mind. My books were coming out in other underground editions, such as Kramerius of Vladimír Pistorius or Expedition Press of Václav Havel and others. We were then approached by the Swiss publisher Jürgen Braunschweiger, by Fischer and German publishing house from Frankfurt am Main, and by Bund Verlag publishers from Cologne. They published my books in German. Thanks to my great translator, Hank Ertz, my book started coming out in Dutch. Czech exile publishers, such as 68 publishers of Josef Škvorecký and Zdena Salivarová in Toronto, or Index in Cologne, Germany, and Rozmluvy in London, began to publish my books in Czech. Seeing my books in my native Czech language brought me great joy. Somehow, it felt more fulfilling than to see them in carbon copies. Manuscripts and books, even those that were non-political, were smuggled into Czechoslovakia via diplomatic channels. Even children's books were smuggled in German. In German culture and press attaché were given direct orders from the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Swedes were also quite helpful. I am mentioning by name at least those whom I was in touch with personally. I became close friends with Václav Havel when he was released from his long prison sentence in 19 1984. During the entire 80s, it was as though we were waiting together with all of the other Soviet satellites until the international situation was ripe for change. The Soviet Union was armed to the teeth, while the economies all over the Soviet bloc were collapsing. It was like robbing Peter to pay Paul. I made my living by writing German tourist guides of Prague under the pen name of Albert Neumann. I got this job thanks to a friend, a great writer named Jiří Grusha, who was living in exile. Guidebooks were always being updated and reprinted, and I was working on them with my German translator and helper 3 months each year. In the remaining time, I could write my own books. For many years, I was unable to travel to the West, but in 1988, a new law was passed when the state needed to improve when the state, a new law was passed when the state needed to improve its revenues in a time of economic hardship. Friends, relatives, and institutions were allowed to buy out Czech citizens to travel if he or she were fortunate enough to receive an invitation. This enabled me to leave the country. I left on the first available flight before the Minister of Home Affairs could change its mind. At the Dallas airport in Washington, D.C., I was welcomed with American flags by a delegation from George Washington University. For the first time in my life, I was publicly recognized as a writer. Later, when I was invited to the Harvard University Library to read one of my short stories, I experienced another unforgettable moment. For the first time in my life, I have seen computers. And my guide encouraged me to type in the subject Czech underground literature. I did as I was told, and the computer accepted it. Then she encouraged me to insert my name. I trembled a bit, but complied. On the screen, there appeared 8 titles under my name, listed as carbon copies signed by the author. I began to cry, feeling a bit like Robinson Crusoe, who long ago threw a bottle into the ocean and somehow the message inside arrived at its intended destination. Something similar happened to me in the Special Collection Library of the University of Toronto in Canada. They stared at me. They stared at me as though I were a phantom and asked me to sign their samizdat copies of my writings. Another unforgettable moment occurred at the reception of the American Pen Club in New York City, where Arthur Miller, Susan Sontag, and Kurt Vonnegut attended my reading. I appreciate their presence as an expression of solidarity with Czechoslovakian dissidents.
In January 1989, in New York City, I was involved in a local commemorative week for Jan Palach's self-immolation in Prague 20 years earlier. I made many phone calls to Prague from payphones on the streets, and I was amazed at the energy and vitality of the commemoration back home of this student's act of protest, something which had been hushed up 20 years earlier. Václav Havel was jailed again, then released, and he initiated a petition called A Few Sentences, and the names of these signatories were broadcast by Radio Free Europe. Protest and repression intensified all year up to November. The Berlin Wall had come down, but in Prague nothing was happening. My daughters went to demonstrations where the police beat them up and detained them. On November 17th, I went to a demonstration myself. I was angry that these demonstrations were always the same number of people in the crowds, 5,000, and that the demonstrators were still openly beaten and persecuted by the police. Just to stay at home and wait for my children to return was too much for me. I found myself face to face with the armored special forces.
Then everything picked up speed. Václav Havel founded the Civic Forum, Občanské Forum initiative. I called him and expressed my readiness to help. We met in his apartment half an hour later. I volunteered to supervise communications and to make certain that all Civic Forum proclamation would not contain cliches which had been used in the Communist Party press. We all contributed what was needed. When Václav Havel was elected president, he asked some people from the coordination center of Civic Forum to follow him in the castle where the presidential office was located. I was unable to refuse his request. Though he was not that anxious to take office, there was no one else who was as suitable as he. In effect, he sacrificed himself. We inherited the actual office of the last communist president and first secretary of the Communist Party, the same Gustav Husák. On December 29, 1989, we entered the Prague castle premises, which were still guarded by the army under the jurisdiction of the Communist Home Office. In the long corridors of the castle were soldiers with machine guns beside each window. There were only about 10 of us, and we had but 6 volunteers among us who were skilled in the martial arts. But that is a different story, and this conference is more about the Prague Spring and normalization. I would like to thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Ada and Rachel. This was very remarkable, and what a start we are having here. You know, this is wonderful. So let's have a Q&A session. So I do believe there are many of you who have some questions, so please. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Paul Wilson.
Thanks. I have a question. You mentioned Petr Pithart and the book 1968 or 68, in which he analyzes the whole Prague Spring debacle from beginning to end. And one of the things that he mentions in this book is how journalists who were used to dealing with censors before they published their work were then confronted with the freedom not to have this censorship, and they found the new freedom sometimes, at least at the beginning, confusing. And I was wondering, you had the experience of being a journalist before the Prague Spring and during the Prague Spring. Is Pithart right when he says that the journalists were unprepared for the freedom that they got?
It's difficult to say. I think there was a stream of goodwill to do as much as possible to reveal this 40 years of totalitarian system, and that it was just spontaneous, and somehow the censorship faded during the Prague Spring. But I was not so well experienced because I was on the mother vacation, so and then
Maternal
after
leave,
all,
yes.
after all, it was until 69, when Husa came to power. Everything was just stopped. Like, is it the answer to your question or not?
Well, it's,
Maybe I misunderstood.
I was only trying to determine whether or not Pitt Pithart was accurate about the confusion that he felt. He tells a story, I think, about how when in January there was a General Hana who was plotting to organize some kind of coup to bring Novotny back or to support Novotny, and the coup is exposed, and he escaped to the west.
Yes.
And the communists went to, or rather, someone from the Central Committee went to Rude Pravo and said, "Would you please write about this?" And they had no idea how to write about something that they had never been allowed to write about before. So there was this kind of confusion that happened after, when censorship was loosened up, even in January of that year. So I'm just wondering, is that
It's I don't remember it very well. How was it with General Hana? I'm sorry, but of course it was lots. It's not. If you understand, if you.
I mean, the story is very murky to this day, and there's been a lot written about it, and it's still not unclear whether General Hana was in the process of preparing a coup or whether he was a black marketeer who, who was caught with his hands in the till and made his escape as a, as a newborn reformist. Or so I mean, but the truth is, Edda, and I think that's the gist of Paul's question, is that there were excellent journalists, and you and I remember them as commentators, as essay writers, but there were no reporters. I mean, there were, what we call investigative journalism today was almost unheard of, and we were all, learning on the job, and it was similar in 1989.
Also, I remember better the series of articles on the death of Jan Masaryk. I think that was all maybe done more than it was asked for. It's not yet clear if Jan Masaryk was murdered by KGB or jumped out of the window in the Chernin Palais. So then started this big topics, started in Prague Spring, but were not finished, of course, or cleared up.
So do we have another question?
Yeah, you mentioned your feelings about Dubcek, and I know that if you would comment a little bit about what the relationship was between Hovel and Dubcek at the time when Dubcek had his fatal accident, or even slightly before, because I think there's been kind of a general feeling among some people that had an impact on everything that was happening at that time. I'm talking about later when Dubcek had his accident, so not in 1968, but later on.
Well, I can't say anything on Dubcek's accident. I mean, it's out of my horizon, I would say. I don't know. And the relationship between Havel and Dubcek was they were not friends. They were so different that, I don't know really. Excuse me. Do you know? Thank you, Mikhail. You
No. I don't want to, monopolize this, but there is a very amusing incident from the Prague Spring 1968, which Havel describes in I think, Disturbing the Peace, or one of the other books, when he was invited with a group of reformist writers to meet with Dubcek and the other leaders, which Černík was there, I think, and others. And the way Havel reports it, he was so nervous that he had about 3 glasses of brandy before he went to speak to Dubcek. And when he did, he behaved terribly. He gave him all kinds of advice, and he didn't listen to what Dubcek had to say. And he describes it in this self-depreciating way that Havel wrote about himself. It's a sweet story, but that was the extent, and he's very explicit on that. That was the extent of Havel's dealings with Dubcek in 1968.
Okay, thank you, Michal.
I can add a little bit to that as well, because Joseph Skorecki wrote a book about 1968 called Miracle, or the Miracle Game. And in that, there's a lot of the characters are, it's a roman à clef, so a lot of the characters are real, but they have fictional names. And there's a scene in the novel when a world-famous playwright, whose name is Hale in Skorecki's book, has this sort of drunken conversation with Dubcek. And he tells Dubcek, don't worry, everybody is for socialism. We're not trying to bring capitalism back. And he said, I'm a millionaire's son, and I don't want to be rich again. I've lived that life. And when I read this, when I translated it, I couldn't imagine Havel saying those things to Dubcek. I can't imagine him ever saying, don't worry, we're not trying to bring capitalism back, we're all for socialism here. That doesn't sound like him, but it's a novel, so.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have another question. I left Czechoslovakia in 1968, few days after the tanks rolled in, and so I wasn't there, but I was really observing and buying and reading assiduously. In fact, we were reading all the books that were published by 68 publishers, Konfrontace, and on and on. And I was always thinking, and then somebody told me that about 25% of the publications of the output of those publishing houses went back to Czechoslovakia. If it is true, what was the impact of those publications that either were published, or the books that were published in the West, and or that made it across the border, and how was it distributed among the people, if you can comment upon that?
I mentioned it already when I told that there were diplomat ways. I mean, the Swedish also, but I hadn't much contact with Swedish. My main contact was with Wolfgang Scheurer, who was a German culture and press attaché, and through whom we were sending our manuscripts by letters, even money back, like to Scheinfeld, to the documentation center of a Czech literature in exile. It was on Schwarzenberg Castle in Scheinfeld in Germany, where Wilhelm Prečan was the director of it, and it was all going through diplomatic ways to this center of independent Czech literature. So, and the Americans, as far as I know, were not so active because they were very much watched.
But what was
And spread, yes.
Czech and Slovak scene?
Well, There was just these people who were living in so-called ghetto, were spreading the books and the money and also different texts. And so they were very well known among the dissidents, and then it was circulating like Edice Petlice Vaculík's underground publishing house. There was rewriting. There was just, let's circulate this samizdat, and the people who wanted, who were interested, they were making more and more copies, and nobody knew how many copies are circulating. It was, in fact, it was, the trick was that it was the first edition, like 14 copies, or because this is all you can put in one at once in the typewriter. They were signed by author, so there was like his own activity, but of course nobody knew how many copies were, because according to the law it should be, they could find out, I don't remember now, I think 30 copies. Then it would begin to be illegal, and the author could be punished. And so I remember that one lady who was making copies was sentenced, and we couple of band writers signed a petition in her favor, because we were arguing that she has not written the text, she only made copy. So it was more dangerous sometimes it was dangerous for the ladies and men who were writing samizdats, rewriting samizdats. Is it? And so you could find out somewhere somebody who had your book in some remote village, who had manuscript, in fact. Nobody knew the ways, and nobody wanted to know it, of course.
All right, so do we have a question still? So I think maybe shall this be like one of the last ones? Okay.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you, or anybody else who has knowledge of it, is that dealing with how surprised were you when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact forces invaded? I mean, had there been discussions that, hey, this movement might be going too far, we might be inviting some radical action on the part of the Soviet Union? Did you ever think that it might happen beforehand?
I don't know, maybe I misunderstood. Hana. What is it?
Yeah.
Can you
Jestli jste diskutovala s někým, že je možná invaze, že se chystá invaze, nebo že jestli se lidi báli v tom.
I was talking about it already, that I think people believed our representatives, and they were lying. They were saying that there is no danger, that they will not come. And they knew that they are going to come because they had their dealings. So they only, this is what I blame of reform communists, that they wanted to be popular, they wanted to be nice to the people, and they wanted to be beloved. Because that was for the first time in their life that they felt like human solidarity or even human faith to them. And so they didn't say the truth. I mean, so I think that I'm really blaming them, and I'm blaming Dubcek because he was a liar. And then he came back, he signed the protocol in Moscow, so humiliated protocol, and he came back and he wept when he. So it's what kind of politician is it?
Thank you.
It's for me. It's my opinion. I mean, then other people might see it differently.
So let's have a last question because of the, I guess people are hungry. So, Markéta, thank you.
Just a small comment on samizdat. I got 2 samizdat books and was intended to take them back to the Canadian embassy because I had to leave the country then. And I thought, how am I going to manage that? And as I drove along the Václavské náměstí, there was a man walking along the side, and I thought he could help me. It was Pavel Landovský. And I stopped the car, and I said, mohl byste si vzít ty 2 knihy? And he said, jo. And he saw immediately what was going on. I was not afraid. I was afraid in one way that they wouldn't let me in again the following year because I went every year. And so we drove. He said, I should go to the Demínka. I didn't know where the Demínka was. And he thought I was a little bit out of it, which maybe was true. And so we went to the Demínka, and I took a couple of Czech newspapers and put the 2 books, which by chance, one of them was yours, Edda. And I passed them on to Landovský, who took them and talked about the weather and left the Demínka. And I went relieved, I'm sorry to say, from these wonderful books because I could leave the country again and say, I haven't got nothing. Yeah. So that's all. Just my small footnote on the topic. Yeah.
What a lovely last comment. So thank you everybody for attending this session, and there are 2 concerts this afternoon, and then the talks are on tomorrow again. So enjoy the rest of the conference, and we have to thank these speakers. Yeah.